You're listening to the DIY Recording Guys podcast, your one-stop information source for DIY music production, with your hosts, Vadim Karaz and Benjamin Hall.
All right, welcome to another episode of the DIY Recording Guys podcast. I'm Vadim from Comfrog Recording.
And I'm Ben from Dreamloud Studio. And it's Black Shirt Day on the podcast.
Black Shirt Day, yes. And it's Coffee Day because typically we record in the evenings at beer o'clock, but this time we're recording on a nice Saturday late morning, early afternoon, so it's still coffee o'clock.
Coffee game is on point.
Absolutely.
It's a necessity in the
coffee
studio.
Coffee game has got to be on point. It is a necessity in the studio. It's just a nice ritual, even if it's, I don't even care about the caffeine, even if it's decaf coffee. I'm good with it. The other thing is in the summer, I do a cold brew every now and then. I'll make a big batch of cold brew. It stands overnight. Put it in the fridge. Tasty. And oat milk. I've gone the oat milk route as well.
Oat milk's really good. I like it.
Yeah.
I think of all the fake milks, it's the best tasting of the, non-lactose milk, I would say.
Yes. Of all the things you can milk that isn't a cow, I think oats have been most successfully milked for sure.
Yeah. Do you do any lattes or anything like that? Or are you just strictly black coffee and with cream in it?
Yeah. I would love to be able to do lattes. I don't have like an espresso machine. That's too much. If I'm going to shell out those kind of bucks, it's going to be on studio gear.
Yeah, I hear you. One thing that I do that kind of works a little bit, I have one of those electronic whiskers. And not whiskers, but like a whisk, like stirring whisk. And so I'll heat up like just 1 ounce of milk for maybe, 15 seconds or something like that. Get it warm without boiling, and then whisk it, and it gets that froth. It's not as good as steaming it, but it's kind of like a poor man's way of being able to make a latte.
Totally. I've done the same thing. It aerates it. It kind of makes it foam up a little bit. You pour some on top. It's almost as good. Yeah.
Almost.
Right
Not quite, but almost. Yeah. So little hacks there for you guys when you're working in the studio.
Yes. DIY coffee recording guys. I do tell people that when they come to the studio, I will make delicious coffee. You know what's funny, Ben, is tasting coffee to me, the journey has been a lot like my critical listening journey. I feel like there's so much subtlety and nuance. And when I first got into it, I was just like, it's coffee. I can't tell the difference between this or that. But as over the years, I've kind of honed the senses a little bit. And now I can taste these little subtle nuances, just like with audio, where I used to not be able to tell what I was listening to. And now I can tell a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, it comes down to like the quality that you're listening to or tasting as well, because I mean, if you're just drinking Folgers, then you have to add copious amounts of sugar and milk to that, because nobody wants to taste what that tastes like black.
Cool. Well, what are we talking today? We have another courtesy of Dreamloud Studio episode I'm looking forward to. Why don't you introduce it for us?
Yeah, so this song I wrote about a year ago, and I decided that I wanted to do like a full band version of it. So I asked my band Nafel if they would help me out in the studio recording the drums and the guitars and the bass. I had originally done all the pre-pro in my studio, which included programmed drums. So I figured we could use this great opportunity to compare a programmed drum kit to a real live performance with maybe some samples used as reinforcement. And we could talk about the pros and cons and the drawbacks of using, a real recording versus programming. So very excited to dive into this. I hope it's going to be illuminating, and I hope that I won't get raked over the coals too much for my drum editing.
Yeah, so we've done an episode previously on making MIDI sound real. So if you're interested in tips on how to do that, check out that episode. Just search our catalog for MIDI. And we did a pretty in-depth look at that. So it sounds like basically you're considering 3 different options here. 1 is just raw recorded drums. 2 is MIDI programmed drums, which is what you did when you wrote the song in pre-production. And the third one is kind of a hybrid where you're using the live performance, but you're maybe augmenting the drum hits with some samples.
Yeah. And in this situation, I'm really only comparing the real drums with sample reinforcement, because as we'll get into listening to it, especially the kick drum, like there's no way this genre could work with the way that the acoustic kick drum sounded. Like it needed something else reinforcing it.
Ooh, okay. Cool. Well, where do you want to get started?
So I guess we could just listen through. Oh, you know what I will do? I will give you some notes about um, the program drums, and then maybe we can listen to that first. I think I have that. I nicely laid out all the tracks, and I think that was the first one, just the program drums. So before we listen to that, some notes about it. I used Get Good Drums, the Invasion drum kit, when I programmed that. I like that kit a lot. It's got 6 toms, a lot of options, different kicks and snares that you can use. And the cymbals that they use are minal, a lot of different minal cymbals in there. And I'm a big fan of minal because they have that darker tone, and I feel like it's easier to get them to sound pleasant in a mix, whereas Zildjian in particular to me are just very harsh. They're bright, they're up there in the top end, but you're also kind of just fighting them, like punching you in the face. They're just in that range where like the vocals kind of sit, and I'm just a more fan of a smoother cymbal sound, so that's why I like that Get Good drum kit. I did some pre-mixing in the actual program itself, so they have like reverb controls and something that they call turbo, which is a combination of compression and EQ. So you can have it completely off and just have a raw drum recording in your samples, or you could turn up this turbo dial that is some like percentage mix of what they think is a good sounding processed drum kit. So I did some of that to taste. I do a lot of pre-mixing with the great thing about program drums is that you can adjust the amount of different mics that are going into the room. And so I do a lot of that pre-mixing up front, where I like to have a lot of snare drum in my room mic and not as much cymbal and not as much toms or kick. And the great thing about having a program kit is if you have a good one, you can really hone those levels that will fit, what your mixing flow or recording flow or just what you like the sound of. Whereas as we'll get to real drums, you're at the mercy of the microphones in the room and the player. And sometimes you'll have too much cymbal and there's not too much you could do about that.
Right.
And the last note about the drums is they are 100% quantized to the grid, and there's no velocity adjustment. They are
okay.
Yeah, I think they are around 80 to 90% all of the hits. There's no variation whatsoever, and it's completely on 100%. No humanization.
Okay. All right.
So cool. Let's take a listen to that. Just the drums.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Obviously a little robotic and a little stiff, but that makes sense because all your velocities are the same and everything's quantized, so it's what you would expect. And it's actually, I think, if anything, a testament to this virtual instrument that you still get a little bit of variety, as good VIs do get you, because they're still sampling from a various number of hits on each shell and even each cymbal. Because if you really had one single cymbal sample, it would sound very robotic. So I think with a bit of humanization, it's a nice sounding drum part.
I think so. one note about what we listened to, I did notice that a couple of those snare hits, there's not any the decay seems like it's cut off, and I think that's probably
Yes.
because I chopped this song up when I was editing it, so it wasn't the actual programmed part specifically that I exported. I had chopped the full length song up into that short little clip
Oh,
that we
okay.
heard, and so that's
I
why it
see.
sounds like that.
I did notice that yeah, especially when comparing to the real drums, that the some of the snare sustain was very spiky and very kind of abrupt. So
Yeah,
yeah, okay, good to
I
know.
think that's why, because I clipped it up. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, so now that we heard what I started with in the pre-pro, let's talk about what I did to even think about going into the studio to record, real drums. I guess some thoughts and ideas heading into that. So, first thing is I knew that I had to get a really good drummer to play this part because it had to be I wanted something that was like very on time, very kind of quantized because even the guitars I had to do a decent amount of editing to kind of get that very um percussive feel to them. So this isn't like a genre that I feel like you could get away with doing one take and not doing any editing. Like most humans aren't capable of playing something that tight. So this is going to have to be something that like a good drummer that has a good sense of time is going to have to record, and it's going to have to be heavily edited after the fact too. So that was the first thing. The second thing, I guess, is just having the right drum kit and cymbals, and it just kind of made sense to ask my friend Jake from the Fell because he likes playing this style. He's got a kit that kind of is suited towards playing this, and he's
Mm.
got, I think, all 100% of his cymbals are Meinl cymbals, so it's a very kind of one-to-one
Oh, so it's
comparison
the
there.
same symbols as you had in your in the pre-pro
Not
kit, or
necessarily,
similar
not
anyway.
necessarily the same, but similar. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Hmm.
So that helps a lot too. I think where we'll hear the most difference is in the kick drum and the snare because he has a very unique setup for the kick drum in particular.
Oh,
So that was
okay.
the first thing. Yeah. So some other details about the drum kit. He used a Thomas Star Classic. I actually don't know what the shells are. I think that they're birch. I think they're birch shells,
Hmm.
which is a good kit for recording. His snare drum, I actually have the same exact snare drum. It's I don't know the model of it, but it's Tama and it's a Bobenga 11 ply snare. Very loud,
Mm-hmm.
uh very cool sounding snare drum. The kick he had is a tiny kick. I think it's like an 18-inch or a 20-inch. I don't think it's 20-inch though. I think it's like an 18-inch kick drum, so it's very tiny, smaller. And he has no porthole on it because he has beautiful artwork of Nefel's last EP release, and he didn't want to
Hmm.
cut it out in any way, and there wasn't a good spot to cut it. So I just
Oh
told him that's
wow.
fine. We'll leave it on there, and so we had to, instead of putting the kick in mic inside the drum like you typically would, we put a 57 on the front of the kick to capture the beater attack, and then
Ooh, interesting.
yeah, and then a beta, and which I had never done before, and so I was curious to see how that would turn out. And then a beta 52 on the kick out. The drums, they have been heavily edited, but not sample replaced. I also recognize too that there would need to be a lot of additional processing that would need to be done to these tracks to get them sounding the way that I wanted to. But I was a little bit limited on time throwing this together for the podcast, and I felt that they were good enough to show.
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
and some of the edits, as you'll hear, they're not transparent enough. And that was due. So this is a big key. And I actually kind of forgot about this because it's been a while since I've recorded and produced drums. But there's a lot of like phasey, weird editing artifacts that you're going to hear in the cymbals. And that was mostly due to the amount of double kick patterns that the drummer played. And because in this style there's so much high end, or there's so much treble needed in the kick drum for that clicky attack sound, it becomes very obvious if the kick patterns aren't right on with the grid. And so if you're doing very intricate stuff, it requires a lot of heavy-handed, intricate editing to the kick drum. And whenever you're moving a lot of kick hits that a drummer naturally is just going to kind of play out of time, it's their own way of kind of doing a beat or a groove. And if you need to edit those heavily, you're going to get really weird phasey things happening, especially in the cymbals, because essentially it's like you're having the cymbal double hit at places where it was a single hit, because you need to move those kick parts to match up well enough to fit the groove. So
right.
With knowing that, if I were to do this again, and we were limited on time, so I'm totally fine and happy with what we got, but I would probably suggest to the drummer, try playing something more simplified that's a tighter groove. And that's some advice that I'll give to you guys if you're trying to record real drums out there. If you have a drummer that's really having trouble playing a specific pattern, especially if it's a complicated one or complicated fills, I would suggest like punching in and specifically grabbing the fills so that you know that they're good, or suggesting to the drummer, or if you are the drummer, just suggesting to simplify your part down so that the amount of editing can be more transparent, or that you just have to do less editing in general. Any thoughts on any of that, Vadim?
Right. No, I think you're exactly right. That's one of the challenges with live drums is you have shells, which are relatively short in duration, and you have cymbals, which ring out for relatively long in duration. And so when you're editing, you're looking at those transients. If you have a lot of shell hits and, kind of a sparse eighth note, quarter note, or something cymbal hit, you're going to run into issues, because as you're editing a drum kit, you're editing all the tracks together as a group, and you're chopping up those cymbal decays, and they can start to sound a little bit unnatural. So that's definitely a big concern, and I'm sure we'll talk about pros and cons. That's definitely one of the cons of working with live drums, is the amount of editing that you have to do.
Before we get into that, a couple other solutions to what we were just talking about there is you can record your cymbals and shells separately. I've seen that being done on some recordings. You can also have a trigger pad for the kick drum. Just don't even have a kick drum there, and either have the drummer play on a kick pad so that it feels natural, but you're not actually capturing any sound from the kick. And you can program that later, or just have the drummer play just the kick hits again and capture that. Or you can actually capture the MIDI from a trigger pad and do it that way. So those are two solutions to kind of solving that editing trouble if you have a really difficult drum part or a drummer that is struggling playing a specific performance. But yeah, we can dive in and listen to, I think the first one on that list is just the raw recordings that we got.
Cool. So I'm gonna play a couple bars of that, and then I'm gonna switch back and forth between the programmed and the raw kit.
Sounds good. What do you think?
Yeah, it was interesting listening through this. And I'll say this is something I do a lot of, is drum programming for artists, and I'll talk about some of the tricks that I use and why I like it. So I'm a big proponent as a guitar player. I've always done a lot of drum programming, and I think you can definitely do a lot to get by with it. But here's the big takeaway I had. I've never done this kind of a shootout before with a raw kit versus a programmed kit. And to me, I'm actually still processing how to talk about this. But the best way I can think of explaining it as a visualization, especially in the mix when I was listening to the mix, to me, there's a level of energy in the live recorded kit that is a level above the programmed kit. And to me, I think about a visualization. When I listen to Jake playing the kit, I see him grooving to the beat, and he's in a sweaty t-shirt and his head is moving. And when I listen to the program kit, I see a guy in a button-down shirt whose head isn't moving at all, and his face is impassive. He just has a blank expression on his face, and he's playing the drum. He's a good drummer, and he's just playing the drums really well. So for me, that was kind of the level of difference. And I'm trying to think about what is it in the little performances that is that nuance. And part of it obviously is the humanization that's missing that you haven't done yet to the program kit, which you could do, right? Changing the velocities. And I was thinking something like, well, Jake playing the parts, he knows what's coming next. He's anticipating the groove. He's responding to the music. And I can kind of feel his hands moving and pushing and pulling, even though, the drums are edited. So that's kind of the big difference for me. But well, I'm sure we'll talk more about it as we get into the pros and cons. What do you think?
I think that is a great way of summarizing, what is so great about recording a real drummer is that, especially if you're not a drummer yourself, which I happen to have the privilege of knowing some about drums. I've played drums a lot in the past, not as good anymore, but to just hear another drummer, what they're doing on a part that's programmed, going from like, here's a programmed idea, do something with it, drummer. It's very interesting to hear like the physicality that each part of the performance takes, and to hear how that affects, how hard each specific drum is hit, or what the emphasis is put on different things. And that's something that's kind of hard to picture if you don't play drums, or haven't actually sat down at a kit or seen another drummer do a variation on that part. And maybe we can hear that later in the more the double time section, but you can't hit all those snare drum hits at the same velocity as like an open beat where it's just quarter notes, because you're playing things a lot faster. So you're just going to lower the velocities, which is something that a human naturally does. But if you're programming it, you have to visualize that and know that that's
and your samples
happens.
have to be good. And that's the other thing I'll say is that it's a great comparison. Jake is obviously a fantastic drummer, and he hits the shells very consistently. Because one of the challenges you will find with a drummer who doesn't hit the shells consistently is the performance will kind of be all over the place. So he's at least getting those clean shell hits. But I don't know if we've hit some of the tom sections yet. On the program, tom sections is where you can sometimes be like, that didn't sound so as natural, right? So where do you want to go next?
So, what's next? What's the next file that we have?
There's real drum, no trigger.
Oh, okay.
Real drum, and then the two with the guitars.
Let's do the real drum, no trigger, because I think what we just listened to was just the raw, and now this will be actually with processing on it, but no triggers. So this is like EQ, compression, all that stuff.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that would be a good comparison to maybe jump back and forth between, just what the raw drums sound like versus what they wound up sounding like after processing.
I'm going to start by playing the mixed drums, and then after a couple of measures, I'll toggle between the raw and the mixed.
Okay.
Still no samples, right? These are just no triggers.
Right. No triggers. It's getting there.
My stream is very glitchy, but even with the glitchy stream, I could hear a huge difference. Much clearer shells, much less muddy and obstructed, just much more open and punchy. So yeah, what I would expect.
Yeah, it's getting there. The two things I was most worried about were the kick and snare, because I felt like uh, I wasn't sure if Jake was hitting hard enough to get like a very punchy snare. But as you heard, just throw some compression on it, and it really did kind of level out everything and get that snare punch that we're all accustomed to hearing. Uh, the other thing that I was worried about was the kick drum sitting where it needed to sit, because I didn't realize this until going in and actually recording his kit. But I think the combination of how small the kick drum is and the way he has it tuned and having no porthole, um, it is really it really sits right in between like 100 and 120 hertz, which is pretty high for a kick drum. And I think maybe in retrospect, I would ask him to try tuning his resonance head down a little bit to get a deeper fundamental frequency, because I kind of felt like the kick drum was a little bit choked out a little bit. Like it wasn't resonating where it really wanted to resonate. Kind of like it had too much tension on it. And so I think the resonance head was actually pushing back against the beater head, and just not allowing the low end to kind of develop the way that I would expect a kick drum. So that was a big challenge, and I cleaned it up a little bit, and that's why I decided to add triggers. I needed a trigger to get the subby kick to have some tone in it, because there was no tone down below 90 hertz. That's where the kick drum kind of rolled off, and it only was air. So it really did require a trigger to be added to that.
Right. Cool. Let's check that out with the triggers then.
Yeah, let's do that.
I'm switching to with no triggers.
Cool. I might have overdone it with the sub on the kick trigger, but it has more of the sound I was looking for.
Well, I was gonna say my stream sounds like a really, really scratched CD, but even still, I can hear like how much more extension into the low end the kick has, and I don't know, it definitely is a big difference, and I think you're right for the genre of music that you're playing, which we haven't played the song yet, but it's a hard rock song.
Mm-hmm.
You like that subbiness in the kick, so and we'll see how it sounds in the mix, but big difference there. So you're just triggering samples on the kick and the snare?
Yes, there was none on the toms.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I'll throw out another trick I heard. I'm listening to a book by Mixer Man.
Yeah. Mixer Man.
Yeah, it's like it's a guy who wrote blogs. He works in the industry. So I'm listening to one of his books, which is amusing, about a fake band session. And but one of the cool things he talks about there is this concept of reinforcing the room, which what that means is basically you route your shells to a PA system that's in the room to basically feed more shell sound into the room, that the room mics can capture more shell. And I thought that was an interesting concept. In fact, I'll throw out here, I've never ever tried this, but I'm going to throw it out there for somebody to try if they want to try. I was thinking it might be cool to run your snare mic to a guitar amp and your kick drum mic to a bass amp. Put those in the room and just see what that does. I don't know, just like theoretically, I think that could be a very cool sound, but I don't know.
That could be really cool. Yeah.
In fact, he talks in that book about also using this as a technique to deal with bleed. If you're a band, you're recording the room, everybody's playing together, how you deal with instrument bleed into the room mics, especially if you have to edit the drums. And one of the things he says you can do as a last resort is basically take the recorded shells, which shouldn't have too much bleed, feed that into the PA, into the room, and basically re-record the room track with the sound coming off of the PA instead of coming off of the actual kit. And I thought that was another interesting,
That's a
last
clever
resort.
idea.
I need to save.
Very clever idea. Cool.
Well, so you got your raw sound, you did some mixing, because a couple of things you wanted to reinforce the low end of the kick drum, so you had some reasons to trigger some samples.
Yes.
That's where you are now. What's next?
I guess maybe I could talk about, how some interesting things I had to do with processing whenever it comes to real drums. So, we had some trouble with the front-facing kick beater mic picking up way too much snare drum bleed. And so the original position that we had it was actually on the drum. It would have been on the drummer's right side. And it was facing kind of towards the hi-hat and the snare drum. And we had to flip the side of the kick drum that the mic was on to get more rejection from the hi-hat and the snare, because it was kind of angled towards it too much. And so we were getting, when we added enough top end to get the beater click, the snare drum and hi-hat were almost as loud or louder than the kick drum itself. So I knew that was going to be a problem. So I had to do some additional trickery with phase cancellation. I've talked about it before on the podcast, but you duplicate the track, flip the phase, put a high pass filter on it, and then a compressor. And, using that chain, you can cancel out some of the high end bleed from snare drums and kick drums. Yeah. It's Bo Burnham, I think is his name. Idea. It's a mixing trick you can find on YouTube. He specifically did.
Bo Burnham's a comedian, isn't he?
Oh yeah, that's right. It's Bo. No, it's like Bo Burchell or something like that. I'll look up the name.
Yeah. Oh, that's a cool. I forgot. You have told me about that, and I forgot about it. I love that idea.
It's Bo Burchell. Sorry, Bo. He's the one. It's the first thing that comes up if you search snare bleed trick on YouTube. So if you're looking of how to deal with that, I tried that both on the kick and the snare mic, which they worked a little bit. I still wound up having to use a little bit of a gate to help with bleed on the snare and kick drum. But that's expected whenever you're recording real drums. You're going to get some bleed. It's just a matter of managing the amount of bleed in Deer drums. And yeah, Jake played really well, and he didn't hit his hi-hat twice as loud as a snare, because that can be a real problem for snare bleed.
Yep. Sure. What's the next thing?
I think I have that version with the song is next. So that processed with triggers.
We'll start. We'll start with the live kit, and then I'll just switch back and forth between the sample kit and the live kit.
Okay, cool. It's almost jarring going back and forth because
Cool.
the tones are so different.
Yeah, the tones are very different. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think what I stand by what I said previously is that I think there's a cool level of energy that's there with the real drummer where you can just kind of feel the drummer grooving to it and responding to the music. It takes a lot of work to program drums that respond to the music. You have to really think like a drummer, and certainly is doable. But the live drums are very cool. Do you want to talk about some just pros and cons to kind of wrap up?
Yeah, let's do that. I think before maybe we jump quite into that, I was kind of analyzing. This is kind of a pro and con. I was kind of analyzing, why are the tones so different between the programmed ones and the real drums? And I think a big factor into that is that I wasn't able to use as much room mics as I wanted to in the real drum recording because the room is all Florida pine and it's very live sounding. So the cymbals were extremely loud. And this is one of the benefits of a programmed kit. In that programmed kit, I could make the snare, kick, and toms so much louder than the cymbals because that's what I want. I want the shells in the room more than I want the cymbals in the room. Whereas in this real physical space that we recorded this drum set in, the cymbals were just so loud they were going to take over my whole mix. So I was limited as to how loud I could actually make my room mic.
I was gonna say I actually thought of it from the opposite angle, where I thought the program drums, if you put more room into them, I thought they might have sounded. I mean, that would have helped humanize it as well. That's one of the things that I find in tracks I listen to from people on the internet that are doing quick recordings. Is there's sometimes too much shell or too much close mic and not enough room. Adding more room on a program kit is one way to, I find, like increase the humanization level of it or the live sound of it.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I just think that there was more room mic in the programmed kit than in comparison to the
you think there's actually
recording.
more in the program kit?
I think that there is, because I would have wanted to put more snare room into the real recording. I just wasn't able to, and that's why it kind of has that different. It has a narrower character to the real drums. Like everything feels like it's closer, and I think it's because the rooms aren't there to like kind of evolve and give that sense of space, which you hear in the programmed kit more. Let's listen to, or let's listen.
Yeah,
let's.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't
talk about the pros and cons now.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll start with I've already mentioned the pro for the live kit is just that level of energy that I think is there. I'll mention a pro for the programmed kit. A lot of times when you're doing a production, so the way like I have my session usually set up is I'll have my instrument MIDI track with all my drum MIDI, and then I have all my audio tracks so I can bounce out that kit into the individual stems. And even deep into the mix, if I decide, you know what, I think a different tom pattern would be cooler here, it's very easy for me to change that MIDI and just bounce out into those new stems, and all my processing can stay the same. So the flexibility of being able to change parts without having to do weird, wacky editing, or even worse, set up the drum kit again, have the drummer come in again.
Yeah.
That's a huge pro for me for programming.
Yeah, I'd agree with that 100%, because with a real drummer, you gotta know the part pretty well whenever you go into the studio to record it. You have to do a lot more homework up front with the pre-production, which is kind of how we use the program kit. Was this is how we're going to flesh out what we want the song to be like, which is a great way of using both. Do the pre-production with a programmed kit and then go in and record a real kit. But once again,
yes, absolutely.
That is
In fact, that allows you maybe for like a quicker recording process too, because with the program kit, it's already on the grid. You can use that effectively as a click track. Whereas with the live drummer, you might have to do some editing. If you're going to record to the live drums, you may want to do the editing first before people record their parts over it, if you need to do that. So, yeah, it's nice to have both, actually, if you can swing having both.
That's a great point, because we actually did use the pre-programmed drums as a guide for the other performances, because I didn't want the bass player being me and the guitar players playing along with an unedited drum kit, and I didn't want to take up studio time sitting there editing this drums.
Right, exactly. Yep. Yeah, I will say, let's see, another pro of having a real drummer is that a real drummer who is good at their craft can quickly come up with fills and things that by nature intrinsically sound real and human. They can come up with stuff that I've spent hours programming drums, and I'm decent at it, but I'm not a drummer. And so sometimes I have to really struggle to find like good fills that work and make sense and are playable. And a real drummer can come up with that sometimes on the spot. So that's the cool thing about having a real drummer. But editing real drums can be a problem especially if the drummer is not so tight. That can be a con for real drums.
I think the biggest pro, and this is the whole reason I wanted to do this, is to capture a specific human on a specific kit. And you can't get that. You can't get that combination doing programming. Like you're ensuring that you have a completely unique performance that can't be replicated by anybody else on the planet. To me, that's the biggest pro for recording a real drum set.
Yes, and also consistency. Like if you have that human on that kit playing for the album, that human is going to have tendencies, and those tendencies are part of the unique sound that you get. Whereas me programming drums, I might do a different type of fill in a song because I think it sounds cool, but as a result, you get this thing that's kind of sterile, where it's not, oh, I know this. Like I can tell a Mike Portnoy, fill sometimes because he's got a specific thing that he's doing. It sounds different than Mike Mangini, right? But when I'm programming, it's just whatever I think works, and it doesn't have that stamp on it.
Yeah. But, I think even a Mike Mangini programmed drum fill is not going to be the same as a Mike Mangini recorded drum, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Mike Mangini might be close because he's pretty much half man, half machine. That guy is so consistent.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think in summary, to me, recording real drums is worth it, but you do have to know going into it, like all of the problems you're going to have to face when dealing with everything, because I think there are way more cons to recording. There are way more number of cons to recording real drums nowadays than there are to just programming a drum, because there's so many good virtual instruments that sound good out of the box already. You can't really go wrong with them. But I think that the few pros that recording real drums have, they outweigh all the cons, as long as you know going into it. And we've kind of talked about them a lot on this episode, like all the different things that you have to deal with, everything from the money to booking the session to the time management to all the preparation to having a good drummer, a good kit that's in tune with good cymbals, a good performance, all the editing, all of the processing. If you just know all that going into it, I think it's definitely worth the time and the energy put into it. But you just have to know what you're getting into, or else it's going to be a nightmare.
Agreed. Well summarized. And thank you for sharing these stems with us as always.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, we appreciate it. So if you have any thoughts on drums, reach out to us. Drop us a note in the Facebook group or email us either at vadim@DIYRecordingguys.com or ben@DIYRecordingguys.com. Until next time, it's the DIY Recording Guys reminding you to check yourself
before you wreck yourself.
All right. If you're enjoying the podcast, take a minute to leave a rating wherever you like to listen to it, or share it with your friends on social media. Also, Benjamin and I are working engineers, and we love helping people turn ideas into finished productions. So if you're interested in working with one of us, or just want to discuss a project you're working on, reach out. You can find my work at calmfrogrecording.com, get me on Instagram at calmfrogrecording, or shoot me an email, vk@calmfrogrecording.com. And you can check Benjamin's work out at dreamloudstudio.com. Hit him up on Instagram at dreamloudstudio, or by email, ben@dreamloudstudio.com. And finally, join our Facebook group to engage with a whole group of friendly, like-minded people who are interested in DIY recording. Just search for DIY Recording Guys on Facebook. Thank you so much for listening and for your continued support. I'll see you next week.